January 28, 1944. The winter sky above western Germany was clear enough for contrails to stretch across the horizon like pale scars. Nearly 25,000 feet above the frozen countryside, formations of American bombers pushed steadily eastward. Their destination lay deep inside the industrial heart of the Third Reich. Around them, dozens of escort fighters held their positions, scanning the empty blue for movement. Among them flew one of the largest single-engine fighters ever built. Its broad wings caught the morning sun. Its massive radial engine gave it a blunt, almost oversized appearance. To many German pilots seeing it for the first time, it looked too heavy to be dangerous, too bulky to compete with the sleek Messerschmitts and Focke-Wulfs that had dominated European skies for years. But appearances had always been deceptive in war. As Luftwaffe fighters climbed to intercept the incoming bomber stream, confidence came naturally. Many German pilots had spent years mastering aerial combat. They knew how to exploit the weaknesses of enemy aircraft, and the new American fighter seemed to offer many. It did not turn as tightly as a Messerschmitt Bf 109. It lacked the elegant silhouette of the British Spitfire. Even some Allied pilots had questioned whether such a large machine could survive in the unforgiving skies over Europe. Then the distance vanished. A Thunderbolt rolled into a shallow dive, its immense propeller biting into the cold air. The aircraft gathered speed with astonishing force, far faster than many of its opponents expected. The pilot steadied his aim for only a fraction of a second before pressing the firing button mounted on his control stick. 8 Browning .50 caliber machine guns erupted together. From both wings, streams of tracer rounds converged into a wall of fire. Hundreds of bullets crossed the space between the fighters in moments, tearing through aluminum skin, puncturing fuel tanks, shattering cockpit glass, and ripping apart control surfaces. The silence of the upper atmosphere disappeared beneath the violent rhythm of synchronized gunfire. Smoke poured from one German fighter almost instantly. Another broke sharply away, diving toward the clouds in an attempt to escape. A third never recovered from its damaged controls. The enormous American fighter that had seemed slow and awkward only moments earlier continued its dive with complete confidence. Its pilot knew something many of his enemies did not yet understand. The Thunderbolt had never been designed to win beauty contests. It had been built to survive punishment, to dive faster than almost anything else in the sky, and to carry enough firepower that a single firing pass could decide an engagement before an opponent had time to react. Far below, civilians heard nothing. At that altitude, the battle unfolded in near silence from the ground. Only thin white contrails twisted across the blue sky, marking where men fought, lived, or died in machines traveling hundreds of miles per hour. For the crews inside the American bombers, every escort fighter represented another chance of reaching home. They watched through frosted windows as flashes of sunlight reflected from distant aircraft, unable to distinguish friend from foe until smoke appeared. Every Luftwaffe fighter driven away meant fewer attacks on the vulnerable bomber formations carrying thousands of pounds of explosives toward German factories, rail yards, and aircraft plants. Inside the Thunderbolt's cockpit, the pilot remained surrounded by thick armor plating and a rugged airframe built around one of the most powerful piston engines of its generation. The controls felt heavy compared to lighter fighters, yet they inspired confidence. The aircraft absorbed tremendous stress during high-speed dives that might have destroyed more fragile machines. Damage that could cripple another fighter often failed to bring down the massive American aircraft. Holes could appear across its wings, oil could streak across the canopy, cylinders could be damaged, and still the great radial engine often kept turning long enough to carry its pilot back across the English Channel. It was a machine that demanded patience to master but rewarded discipline with extraordinary resilience. The Luftwaffe would eventually learn that chasing a diving Thunderbolt was often a fatal mistake. Its weight, once dismissed as a weakness, became an advantage as gravity accelerated the aircraft beyond the comfort zone of many German fighters. Escape turned into pursuit, pursuit into surprise, and surprise into defeat. By the spring of 1944, the reputation of the P-47 Thunderbolt had begun to change. What some German pilots had first regarded as an oversized target was becoming one of the most feared escort and fighter-bomber aircraft over occupied Europe. Its 8 Browning machine guns, capable of unleashing thousands of rounds in seconds, earned respect wherever they were encountered. More importantly, the men flying it were growing increasingly experienced, developing tactics that exploited every strength of their remarkable aircraft. The story of how this unlikely giant earned that reputation began long before those freezing skies over Germany. It started years earlier, when the outcome of the air war was still uncertain, and the United States Army Air Forces faced a challenge unlike any they had encountered before. By the middle of 1942, the Second World War had entered a new and far more demanding phase. Across Europe, Nazi Germany still controlled an empire that stretched from the Atlantic coast of France to the outskirts of the Soviet Union. The Wehrmacht remained one of the most experienced fighting forces on Earth, and despite setbacks on the Eastern Front, German industry continued to produce tanks, artillery, submarines, and aircraft in staggering numbers. Every factory that remained operational prolonged the war. Every rail yard that escaped destruction kept supplies flowing to the front. Allied leaders understood that defeating Germany would require more than victories on land. It would require breaking the industrial system that kept Hitler's war machine alive. The responsibility for that task increasingly fell upon the United States Army Air Forces. Unlike Britain's Royal Air Force, which relied primarily on nighttime bombing to reduce losses, American planners believed precision daylight bombing could cripple Germany's military production more effectively. Their strategy rested on a simple but dangerous assumption. Heavy bombers flying in tightly organized formations, armed with dozens of defensive machine guns, could fight their way to the target and back again. Aircraft such as the Boeing B-17 Flying Fortress and the consolidated B-24 Liberator became symbols of this doctrine. Each carried large bomb loads deep into occupied Europe, aiming at aircraft factories, ball bearing plants, oil refineries, and transportation hubs that fueled Germany's ability to wage war. On paper, the concept appeared sound. In reality, the skies over occupied Europe belonged to the Luftwaffe. German fighter units had spent years refining interception tactics. Their pilots were veterans of campaigns in Poland, France, the Balkans, North Africa, and the Soviet Union. Many had hundreds of combat hours before American forces even entered the European theater. They understood the strengths and weaknesses of bomber formations. Instead of attacking randomly, they coordinated high-speed passes from favorable angles, concentrating cannon fire on vulnerable bombers before slipping away to prepare another attack. Their principal fighters reflected years of continuous development. The Messerschmitt Bf 109, first introduced before the war, had evolved into increasingly capable variants powered by stronger engines and improved armament. Fast, agile, and deadly, it remained one of the Luftwaffe's primary weapons throughout the conflict. Alongside it flew the Focke-Wulf FW-190, a rugged radial engine fighter whose powerful roll rate, heavy cannons, and excellent low-to-medium altitude performance quickly earned respect from both friend and foe. Together, these aircraft posed a constant threat to Allied bombers crossing occupied Europe. The results were costly. As American bomber missions penetrated deeper into German-controlled territory, losses climbed. Escorts such as the Lockheed P-38 Lightning and the early versions of the Republic P-47 Thunderbolt lacked the fuel capacity to accompany bombers all the way to distant targets like Berlin, Leipzig, or Schweinfurt. Once the escort fighters turned back, bomber crews faced hundreds of miles of hostile airspace alone. German interceptors waited for exactly that moment. One of the clearest demonstrations came during the Second Schweinfurt raid on October 14, 1943. American bombers attacked Germany's critical ball-bearing industry, believing that disrupting production would cripple military manufacturing. Instead, they encountered fierce resistance. Luftwaffe fighters attacked repeatedly throughout the mission. By the time surviving bombers returned to England, 60 B-17 Flying Fortresses had been destroyed outright, while many others limped home with severe damage. Hundreds of American airmen were killed, wounded, or captured in a single day's fighting. The mission exposed the limits of daylight bombing without continuous fighter protection. The lesson was unmistakable. Bombers, no matter how heavily armed, could not win the air war alone. Yet even before these devastating losses, another story had already begun taking shape across the Atlantic. Long before the Thunderbolt earned its reputation in combat, it existed only as an ambitious engineering project born from the realization that future air battles would demand unprecedented performance. The man responsible was Alexander Kartveli, a Georgian-born aircraft designer working for Republic Aviation in the United States. Kartveli had watched developments in Europe with growing concern.
Combat reports showed that aircraft were becoming faster, heavier, and more heavily armed.
Existing American fighter concepts no longer seemed sufficient against the latest German designs. Rather than producing another lightweight interceptor, Kartveli pursued a radically different philosophy.
His new fighter would not rely solely on agility.
Instead, it would possess overwhelming engine power, exceptional high-altitude performance, heavy armor protection, and unmatched firepower.
To achieve those goals, compromises became inevitable.
The aircraft grew larger with every design revision. A massive Pratt Whitney R-2800 double WASP, an 18-cylinder air-cooled radial engine capable of producing more than 2,000 horsepower, formed its heart. Behind the engine sat an advanced General Electric turbo supercharger system that allowed the aircraft to maintain impressive performance even at altitudes where many piston engine fighters began losing power.
The result astonished nearly everyone who saw it.
Compared to contemporary fighters, the new aircraft looked enormous.
Empty, it weighed substantially more than many rivals did fully loaded. Its wide fuselage, thick wings, and giant propeller gave it proportions that seemed almost excessive. Some observers wondered whether it was truly a fighter at all. Even American pilots reacted cautiously. Many had trained on lighter aircraft with crisp handling characteristics. Sitting inside the Thunderbolt's spacious cockpit, surrounded by thick armor and an unusually large engine, some questioned whether such a heavy machine could survive against nimble German fighters. Taxiing required care. Takeoff demanded patience as the powerful engine generated tremendous torque.
In turns, the aircraft felt heavier than its British or German counterparts.
But first impressions often reveal only part of the story.
As test pilots explored its capabilities, they discovered strengths that numbers on paper failed to capture. The enormous engine delivered remarkable speed. The turbo supercharger maintained power at altitudes where strategic bombing missions took place. The robust airframe tolerated steep dives that frightened pilots of lighter aircraft. Damage resistance proved exceptional, and the aircraft could carry an armament unmatched by almost any single-engine fighter in the world.
Those characteristics would soon become invaluable. Across the Atlantic, American units prepared to introduce this unconventional fighter into one of the most fiercely contested airspaces in history. There, among experienced Luftwaffe veterans who believed they had already seen every threat the Allies could produce, the Thunderbolt would receive its first true test and its earliest critics.
The first Republic P-47 Thunderbolts began arriving in Britain during the closing months of 1942, joining the 8th Air Force as the United States steadily expanded its presence in Europe. Their arrival drew immediate attention. Parked beside the slimmer Supermarine Spitfire and the compact Messerschmitt Bf-109s that intelligence officers displayed in recognition manuals, the Thunderbolt seemed almost oversized.
Ground crews joked that it looked more like a small bomber than a fighter. Its fuselage was broad, its wings thick, and its massive four-bladed propeller dominated the aircraft's blunt nose.
Even before it fired a shot in combat, the P-47 challenged long-held assumptions about what a fighter should look like.
Pilots quickly learned that the aircraft demanded respect.
Its Pratt Whitney R-2800 double WASP engine produced tremendous power, but that power had to be managed carefully.
During takeoff, the engine's torque could pull the aircraft to one side if a pilot was careless with the throttle. Once airborne, however, the Thunderbolt revealed a different personality.
It climbed steadily, settled into high-altitude flight with confidence, and remained remarkably stable as a gun platform.
Stability mattered.
Escort pilots often had only a brief firing window against fast-moving enemy fighters, and a steady aircraft could make the difference between a missed opportunity and a confirmed victory.
Among the first units to master the new fighter was the 56th Fighter Group, a formation that would become inseparably linked with the Thunderbolt's combat reputation.
Commanded for much of its wartime service by Colonel Hubert Zemke, the group approached the aircraft not as a flawed machine but as one whose strengths had yet to be fully understood. Zemke encouraged disciplined flying rather than trying to force the P-47 into the style of lighter fighters. Instead of engaging in prolonged turning contests, he emphasized altitude, speed, teamwork, and carefully planned attacks. The aircraft's greatest advantages emerged when pilots resisted the temptation to imitate German tactics and instead exploited the Thunderbolt's own unique characteristics. Another experienced unit, the 4th Fighter Group, also transitioned to the P-47. Many of its pilots had previously flown with the Royal Air Force before the United States entered the war. They arrived with valuable combat experience, yet even they required time to adapt. The Thunderbolt handled differently from the Spitfires many of them knew so well. It rolled differently, accelerated differently, and rewarded patience over instinctive maneuvering. Once pilots stopped comparing it to earlier fighters, confidence began to grow. Combat over occupied Europe remained unforgiving. Throughout 1943, American bomber formations expanded both in size and ambition. Missions reached farther into Germany, targeting factories that produced aircraft, engines, synthetic fuel, and precision bearings. Every successful raid threatened the industrial foundation of Hitler's war effort. Every mission also drew an increasingly determined Luftwaffe response. German fighter controllers monitored Allied bomber streams through radar stations, visual observers, and radio reports. Once a formation crossed the Dutch coast or entered Belgian airspace, interceptors were directed toward likely approach routes. Veteran pilots climbed rapidly to gain altitude before attacking from favorable positions. They preferred high-speed frontal passes or steep diving attacks that minimized exposure to defensive fire from the bombers. When the Thunderbolt first appeared alongside the bomber formations, many German pilots remained unconvinced by its appearance. Compared with the sleek Bf-109G, the American fighter seemed enormous. Compared with the agile FW-190A, it appeared heavy and slow to respond. German intelligence correctly noted its large radial engine and impressive durability, but size alone encouraged overconfidence. Some Luftwaffe pilots assumed the aircraft would struggle in close maneuvering combat and therefore believed they could outturn and outclimb it with relative ease. In certain situations, they were right. The Thunderbolt was not designed to excel in tight horizontal turns. A skilled Bf-109 pilot who forced the engagement into a sustained turning battle could often gain an advantage. American pilots who ignored their aircraft's limitations sometimes paid a heavy price. Early combat reports reveal that experience mattered as much as engineering. Those who attempted to fight the Thunderbolt like a Spitfire often found themselves at a disadvantage. But experienced P-47 pilots gradually changed the rules of the engagement. Rather than remaining in turning contests, they used altitude as a reserve of energy. If threatened, they could push the nose downward and enter a steep dive. Here, the Thunderbolt displayed one of its most remarkable qualities. Its robust construction allowed it to accelerate rapidly without suffering the structural concerns that limited many contemporary fighters. German pilots occasionally attempted to follow, only to discover that the heavy American aircraft continued gaining speed while remaining stable and controllable. Pursuit became increasingly dangerous as compressibility effects challenged aircraft approaching extreme dive speeds. More than one Luftwaffe pilot abandoned the chase rather than risk losing control. This ability transformed the Thunderbolt into something unexpected. It might not dictate every fight, but it could often decide when to leave one. Meanwhile, another advantage quietly influenced every encounter. The Thunderbolt's rugged construction repeatedly saved lives. Combat reports describe aircraft returning with large sections of control surfaces missing, engines scarred by cannon fragments, wings punctured by dozens of bullets, and fuselages torn by anti-aircraft fire. The air-cooled radial engine lacked the vulnerable liquid cooling system used by many inline engine fighters. Damage that might drain coolant from another aircraft and seize its engine could prove less catastrophic for the P-47. Pilots often landed machines that maintenance crews could scarcely believe were still flyable. This resilience earned the confidence of those who depended on it. By late 1943, the Thunderbolt had become more than an escort fighter. Increasingly, it was also employed in fighter sweeps ahead of bomber formations, seeking to engage German interceptors before they reached the bombers. Pilots refined coordinated attacks from altitude, striking with speed before climbing away to prepare another pass. They learned that discipline, rather than dramatic dogfighting, produced the highest survival rates. At the heart of those tactics stood a weapon unlike any carried by most European fighters. While many German aircraft relied on a combination of machine guns and heavier cannons firing relatively limited ammunition, every Thunderbolt carried 8 Browning and /M2. .50 caliber machine guns, 4 mounted in each wing. Together they could unleash an astonishing volume of fire in just a few seconds, creating dense streams of high-velocity bullets that were devastating against fighters and, later, against ground targets. Combined with generous ammunition capacity, the P-47 could sustain firing longer than many of its opponents expected. The aircraft that had once seemed too large to succeed was beginning to reveal why its designers had accepted every extra pound of weight. And as 1944 approached, the Thunderbolt's reputation would no longer be defined by its appearance, but by the destructive force it could deliver when those 8.50 caliber machine guns finally opened fire. The true character of the P-47 Thunderbolt was never revealed by its silhouette alone. It emerged only when pilots learned to stop measuring it against every other fighter in the sky and began understanding why it had been built the way it was. Its story was not simply about speed or firepower. It was about engineering choices that appeared questionable at first glance but proved remarkably effective once tested under the unforgiving conditions of war. For German pilots encountering the Thunderbolt during its early months over Europe, the aircraft often inspired confidence rather than caution. They had spent years flying against aircraft that emphasized agility. The British Spitfire, despite its many variants, remained famous for graceful turning performance. Even the Soviet Yak fighters, encountered on the Eastern Front, relied heavily on maneuverability. The P-47 seemed to reject that philosophy entirely. From a distance, it looked almost cumbersome. Its large radial engine gave the nose a round, muscular profile. The fuselage appeared thick compared to the slender Messerschmitt Bf-109. Fully loaded for combat, the Thunderbolt weighed well over 7 tons, making it one of the heaviest single-engine fighters of the war. To experienced Luftwaffe pilots, accustomed to aircraft designed around lightweight performance, such weight seemed like an obvious weakness. Combat experience initially reinforced that assumption. In slow-speed turning engagements, the Thunderbolt rarely matched the tighter turning circle of a well-flown Bf-109 or the quick roll characteristics of the FW-190. German pilots who managed to force American fighters into prolonged horizontal maneuvers sometimes gained advantageous firing positions. These early encounters encouraged the belief that the oversized American machine lacked the refinement of European fighter design. But those conclusions overlooked a fundamental principle of aerial combat. A fighter's effectiveness depends not on excelling in every category but on maximizing its strongest qualities while avoiding situations that expose its weaknesses. American pilots gradually embraced that lesson. Rather than turning tightly with German fighters, experienced Thunderbolt squadrons emphasized energy fighting, a style built around altitude, speed, and momentum. Pilots climbed before engagements whenever possible, preserving potential energy that could later be converted into speed. They attacked from above, fired brief, concentrated bursts, and then used their aircraft's tremendous diving capability to withdraw before an opponent could respond effectively. This approach demanded patience and discipline. It also transformed the Thunderbolt into a far more dangerous adversary than its appearance suggested. The aircraft's weight, initially criticized as excessive, became one of its greatest advantages during these attacks. Gravity accelerated the P-47 with remarkable efficiency. As it entered a dive, the powerful Pratt Whitney R-2800 engine continued pulling while the heavy airframe gathered speed that lighter fighters often struggled to match. German pilots attempting pursuit sometimes discovered that the distance between the aircraft continued increasing despite full throttle. Many Luftwaffe veterans later acknowledged the Thunderbolt's exceptional diving performance. Trying to chase one downward could become increasingly hazardous. Compressibility effects and aerodynamic phenomenon encountered at very high speeds began affecting all fighters approaching the limits of piston engine performance. Aircraft controls could stiffen dramatically, making recovery more difficult. Although the P-47 was not immune to these challenges, its robust construction and excellent high-speed stability gave pilots greater confidence during steep dives than many competing aircraft. Escaping was no longer an act of desperation. It became a calculated tactical decision. Equally important was the Thunderbolt's ability to survive punishment that might have destroyed more delicate fighters. Alexander Kartveli and the engineers at Republic Aviation had accepted additional weight because they believed durability mattered just as much as maneuverability. Around the cockpit, armor plating protected the pilot from rifle-caliber fire and shell fragments. Self-sealing fuel tanks reduced the risk of catastrophic fires after being pierced by bullets. Critical systems were arranged to maximize the aircraft's chances of returning home despite damage. Its air-cooled radial engine represented another significant advantage. Many contemporary fighters, including the Bf-109 and the North American P-51 Mustang, used liquid-cooled inline engines. These engines offered excellent aerodynamic efficiency but depended upon vulnerable cooling systems. A single well-placed bullet striking a coolant line or radiator could rapidly overheat the engine, forcing a pilot to land or abandon the aircraft. The Thunderbolt's radial engine eliminated much of that vulnerability. Although still susceptible to direct damage, it could often continue operating despite considerable punishment. Wartime photographs reveal P-47s returning with cylinder fins shattered, engine cowlings riddled with holes, and propeller blades scarred by combat. Maintenance crews repeatedly repaired aircraft that seemed beyond saving, while grateful pilots climbed into them again only days later. Stories of extraordinary survivability became common within American fighter groups. Pilots described limping home with damaged control cables, shredded wings, punctured fuel tanks, or anti-aircraft shells embedded in the fuselage. Some aircraft landed carrying hundreds of bullet holes. Others returned with large portions of their tail surfaces damaged or sections of cowling missing entirely. Not every pilot survived. No aircraft could guarantee that. But the Thunderbolt earned a reputation for giving its crews opportunities that lighter machines might not. This growing confidence changed how American squadrons approached combat. Pilots trusted the aircraft to withstand risks that once seemed unacceptable. They flew deeper into defended airspace, escorted bombers through increasingly dangerous missions, and accepted assignments that demanded both endurance and resilience. Yet despite all its engineering achievements, one feature above every other would ultimately define the Thunderbolt in the minds of friend and foe alike. Mounted inside its broad wings weighted 8 Browning and /M 2.50 caliber machine guns, an armament capable of unleashing one of the most devastating streams of fire carried by any Allied fighter. Once those guns opened fire, the Thunderbolt's reputation would change forever. The engineers who designed the Thunderbolt understood that destroying an enemy aircraft often depended less on a single devastating shell than on placing an overwhelming volume of accurate fire on target before the opponent could react. That philosophy shaped one of the P-47's defining features. Buried within its broad wings were 8 Browning and /M 2.50 caliber machine guns, 4 in each wing, carefully positioned to converge their fire at a selected distance chosen by ground crews before each mission. Each gun fired the powerful .50 BMG cartridge at a rate of roughly 750 to 850 rounds per minute. Together, all 8 guns could send well over 100 rounds every second toward an enemy aircraft. A firing burst lasting only 2 or 3 seconds released hundreds of armor-piercing, incendiary, and tracer rounds. Against aluminum airframes traveling at closing speeds that often exceeded 700 miles per hour, that volume of fire could be catastrophic. Unlike many Luftwaffe fighters, which relied heavily on 20mm or 30mm cannon with comparatively limited ammunition, the Thunderbolt carried generous ammunition reserves. Depending on the production block, each gun typically carried around 425 rounds. This allowed American pilots to make multiple attacks during a single mission without immediately worrying about running dry. It also encouraged controlled bursts rather than desperate snapshots, increasing accuracy and conserving ammunition for later engagements. The effect on German aircraft could be devastating. Although an individual .50 caliber projectile lacked the explosive charge of a cannon shell, 8 synchronized machine guns concentrated tremendous kinetic energy into a remarkably small area. Fuel tanks could rupture. Hydraulic lines could be severed. Engines lost power as cylinders and ignition systems were struck. Propeller blades shattered. Control cables snapped. Cockpit armor splintered beneath repeated impacts. Even if an aircraft remained technically flyable, extensive structural damage often forced the pilot to abandon combat. Veteran Thunderbolt pilots emphasized discipline above excitement. They rarely sprayed ammunition at distant targets. Instead, they closed the range patiently before firing. Many aimed to begin shooting only when the enemy aircraft nearly filled the reflector gun sight. At such distances, the dense stream of bullets left little room for escape. The Thunderbolt's stable gun platform further increased its effectiveness.
Its considerable weight, criticized during turning combat, reduced unwanted movement while firing.
Recoil from 8 machine guns operating simultaneously had surprisingly little effect on the aircraft's aim. Pilots frequently described the P-47 as exceptionally steady during attack runs, allowing them to keep their sights on target longer than expected.
Against fast-moving fighters, those extra fractions of a second often proved decisive. German intelligence gradually revised its assessment. Early reports had focused on the Thunderbolt's size and perceived lack of agility.
Later evaluations increasingly acknowledged its formidable firepower and ability to absorb damage while remaining combat effective.
Luftwaffe pilots learned that approaching head-on demanded extreme caution.
Even a brief frontal exchange exposed them to an extraordinary volume of machine gun fire. The Thunderbolt's influence extended beyond air-to-air combat. As Allied forces prepared for the invasion of Western Europe, the aircraft assumed another vital role, that of the fighter bomber.
Its strong airframe could carry bombs beneath its wings and fuselage, as well as high-velocity rockets introduced later in the war.
Bridges, railway locomotives, ammunition depots, troop columns, artillery batteries, and armored vehicles all became targets.
These low-level missions introduced new dangers.
German anti-aircraft defenses, from light automatic weapons to heavy flak batteries, filled the skies with steel fragments. Pilots often attacked at altitudes where even rifle fire posed a threat. Yet the Thunderbolt again demonstrated why durability mattered. Aircraft frequently returned with shattered windscreens, damaged landing gear, torn control surfaces, and countless bullet holes.
Ground crews patched them, replaced damaged panels, repaired engines, and sent them back into combat.
Among Allied soldiers advancing across France after the Normandy landings, the Thunderbolt became an unmistakable symbol of friendly air power. Whenever German troop concentrations, transport convoys, or armored formations threatened in advance, radio calls often brought fighter bombers racing overhead. Their bombs and rockets inflicted significant damage, but many pilots preferred finishing attacks with their 8 Browning machine guns. Strafing runs tore through trucks, fuel bozers, locomotives, horse-drawn wagons, communication vehicles, and exposed infantry positions. Even heavily armored vehicles whose armor resisted machine gun fire could have optics destroyed, tracks damaged indirectly, or supporting transport eliminated, disrupting entire formations. For German ground troops, the distinctive roar of the massive radial engine often signaled only seconds to seek cover. As the war entered its final year, the Luftwaffe faced mounting shortages of experienced pilots, aviation fuel, and replacement aircraft. Meanwhile, Thunderbolt units grew larger, more experienced, and increasingly aggressive. They ranged across occupied Europe, attacking not only enemy fighters but the transportation